Today, the memory of the fabulous richness, pompous palaces and terrifying fortresses of the medieval kingdom of Hungary is kept only in ruins and legends. The buildings have deteriorated, and most of them are waiting deep under the ground to be revealed again. A long time ago, on the mountaintops, on the marshlands, and on the hills towering above them, there were many castles guarding the territory. During this virtual castle tour, we tell you the story of the medieval castles of Hungary, covering about 6 centuries, from the foundation of the kingdom until the beginning of the Turkish occupation. According to the romantic image inspired by tales of chivalry, beautiful ladies and grim armoured knights lived in the castles, but this is only a small part of one-time reality. The history of European castles is closely linked with the social order of the Middle Ages, feudalism and its development. The king's power rested on the castles. Earls and governors appointed by the king were in command of the castles. They led the armed forces of the castle, collected taxes, managed the economic and legal affairs of the domain, and supervised the protection of the castle and order in the territory. Furthermore, they also received their own hereditary lands from the king, where they could build their own manor house, or, if they were rich enough, their own castle. Their military escort consisted of free men. These were the knights, who received a salary or an estate from their lord. Rarely could they obtain their own castle, but they were the commanders of their lord's castles. At the beginning, the lands were cultivated by servants and free peasants. Later on, by free serfs who did not have their own lands and lived in the villages below the castles. In fact, the medieval castle was the lord's fortified residence, which represented the lord's power, provided protection for the inhabitants and their assets, and was also the economic centre of the estate. Esztergom, one of the most important castles of the country, is an excellent example of the entire history of Hungarian castle building. The new capital city, founded by Géza, Grand Prince of the Hungarians, was built on the ruins and from the stones of a late Roman fortress. And in the 11th century, it was fortified with earth banks supported with a wooden structure. At the end of the 12th century, it was converted into a Gothic palace. This was when the polygonal residential tower, the chapel and the grand hall were built. Between the 14th and 16th century, it was transformed into a magnificent Gothic Renaissance palace for the archbishop. Splendid halls, chapels and suites were added to it, and towers were built in the walls. During the Turkish occupation, the castle was located on the border of the two empires, and it was converted into a modern fort with cannon towers and bastions. After all the reconstructions, the oldest parts of the castle of Esztergom had disappeared, but the walls of Visegrad, its former advanced fort, are still standing today. The castle of Visegrad was also built on Roman ruins. By the second half of the 10th century, it had become the centre of the forest lands of the Árpád dynasty in the Pilis Hills. The castle and its county is mentioned in archive sources for the first time in 1009. It was one of the first elements of the county system created during the 11th century. Within the turreted stone walls of the castle of Visegrad, in a stone house divided into 2 compartments, lived the governor, and probably the illustrious guests arriving at the castle were also accommodated here. The chapel was built in the castle yard. The late Roman governor building was erected in the middle of the stone wall facing the Danube, which was later converted into a residential tower with a wooden staircase leading up to its entrance. The ground floor of the tower, divided with pillars, functioned as a storeroom. The 2 rooms on the upper floor were used as a living area. The latrine could be accessed from one of the residential rooms and was situated in a separate small tower. A protection terrace was built on the roof where large siege engines could be set up. The residential tower contained all the functions of a medieval castle, protection, a magnificent residence, and a safe treasury, all representing power. Tower and power became inseparable concepts. Residential towers were also used as prisons. According to the Illuminated Chronicles, in 1083, Saint Ladislaus I, King of Hungary, imprisoned King Solomon in the Tower of Visegrad. Solomon's injured heart was filled with consuming anger and bitterness. Seething with anger, tempestuously, he was scheming to shed the innocent blood of Ladislaus. But he was caught in his own trap. King Ladislaus took Solomon red-handed, captured him and imprisoned him. Ladislaus did not do so out of fear, but because his royal cousin had always been threatening him that he would act even meaner than before, so he wanted to suppress his anger. But when King Stephen was canonized, Ladislaus set Solomon free, and one of the towers of the castle of Visegrad, built later, still bears his name. In the Gothic era, the demands of royal courts increased significantly, and rulers erected more and more magnificent palaces. The castle of Óbuda is one of the most marvellous examples of these. King Bela IV started to build it in the 1230s, when he was still a prince, and it was finished after he was crowned in 1235. Óbuda took over the function of the royal seat of Esztergom, and it remained the main residence of Hungarian kings until the end of the 13th century. King Bela IV had a modern, regular castle built with a rectangular floor plan, in line with the new trend of the era. New types of castles were built as the Gothic style appeared. Europeans, returning from the Holy Wars, used the achievements of castle architecture in the Holy Land. In accordance with this, a dual protection system was constructed in Óbuda. The castle was surrounded by a moat and an external wall, while the internal courtyard was enclosed by palace wings. The chapel stood next to the gate tower, in the eastern part of the northern wing, while the vaulted grand hall was situated on the western side. Both building parts had 2 floors. The people of the court used the lower floor, and the king used the upper floor. The residential rooms were situated in the eastern and southern wing. A corridor with a line of windows facing the Danube ran in front of the southern wing. The bathroom, which was a rarity in contemporary Europe, was probably situated at the eastern end of the ground floor of this wing, and generally it consisted of 2 rooms. A hypercourse chamber, functioning as a sweating chamber, and a room next to it, where the bathtub was placed. The hypercourse, the underfloor heating, was left behind by the Romans. The thick stone floor was supported by columns standing close to each other, and the space between them was filled with air heated from outside. In Óbuda, the floor heating system that remained under the red marble floor did not only heat the 3.5-metre wide chamber, but the pipes conducting the hot air also ran in the walls. At the beginning of the 13th century, the most powerful barons accumulated an enormous fortune. King Bela IV wanted to break their power and their arrogance, so he claimed back the lands he had granted to them previously. The conflict became even more serious after the famous scene that took place in the throne room of Óbuda, which was recorded by the old chronicle Rogerius in his Carmen Miserabile. To suppress the daring intrepidity of the barons, he ordered that if any of the barons sits down in his presence, except for princes, bishops and archbishops, they must be punished as they deserve. At the same time, he had all the seats of the barons that he could find burned. The barons grew so angry with the king that they did not line up their armies in the Battle of Muhi. The king's army was badly defeated, and the Mongols razed the kingdom of Hungary. After the Mongol invasion, a real castle-building campaign started. Small but practically unconquerable stone castles were built on inaccessible mountaintops, one after the other, with high walls and tall towers. A typical castle type of this era was Mohosvar in Kelemir, which was built by the members of the Gut-Keled clan in the Buk Mountains. King Bela IV learnt a good lesson from the disaster and changed his policy. He granted numerous royal lands to the nobility with the condition that they had to build new, modern castles. Mohosvar, with an oval floor plan, towered above two lakes. Similarly to other castles of the era, it stood on a place that could be easily seen and favourably protected at the same time. It was built on the basis of a simple plan. It was surrounded by a wide and deep moat that had an earth bank running along its external side and a palisade on the inside. Its round donjon and tiny courtyard was surrounded with a stone wall. Where the castle had to be protected the most intensively, a rectangular tower was built outside the wall. Wooden residential buildings and workshop buildings were attached to the round tower and to both sides of the western ring wall. The stairs were also made of wood, as was the machicolation running along the stone walls and the protection level and the roof structures of the towers. The workshops were situated next to each other in the line of buildings on the western side, similarly to larger castles. Within the walls, but separated from the residential buildings. The blacksmiths also worked here in the vicinity of one of the castle ovens. Often these castles did not last long at all. Most of them were destroyed during the era of feudal anarchy, when noblemen were competing against and pillaging each other. Finally, in the 1320s, Charles I crushed the power of the landlords and divided the kingdom. The bloody sieges and battles of the era were also recorded in the royal charters. Courageously advancing, he saw the death and destruction of many of his people, and did not regret that many of his soldiers had been injured and their blood had been shed, and there were only a few of them who wiped off their fighting sweat, with linen reddened and soaked in blood, and survived. At the price of savage battles, strict blockades and prolonged efforts, he captured and seized many fortresses, said the king, praising the heroism of his follower, Governor János Babonich, in 1317. Charles I had some of the noblemen's castles destroyed, and in the place of the remaining forts, his son, King Louis, had splendid palaces built. This is what he ordered in connection with the castle of Governor Ernie in Diósztyr. After he had been crowned King of Poland, he set up one of his secondary residences here along the road to Krakow. After it had been reconstructed, the royal castle became a representative of the castles built in the Gothic style all over Europe, with a square central courtyard. It was surrounded by protection rings divided into many sections, and a slender tower stood in each of the four corners of its courtyard. On the first floor of the eastern wing of the splendid castle of Diósztyr, along two sides of the chapel, the king's and the queen's private suites were built, which had the same arrangement. Suiting the customs of the era, both the female and male suites consisted of 3 rooms. Their entrance led into the central largest room. From here, the 2 smaller rooms could be accessed. Both the king and his wife had a prayer chamber opening from the room next to the chapel, and from their prayer chamber, they had a view to the main altar of the chapel. The most intimate part of the suites, the bedroom, was situated on the opposite side in the corner towers. From the courtyard, a large decorative staircase led to the entrance of the third and the most spacious suites of the castle, which was probably fitted out for the Queen Mother, Elizabeth, in the southern wing. In the autumn of 1381, a magnificent delegation arrived in Diósgyőr, members of the missions of Geneva and Venice. In the summer, King Louis had defeated Venice, and the noblemen and their attendants came to sign the peace treaty of Turin in the scope of a pompous ceremony to end the war. King Louis I received the delegations in the Hall of the Knights, which was the most important and largest room in the palace. The peace treaty itself was signed in the neighbouring room. In the treaty, among other obligations, Venice undertook to hoist the flag of the Hungarian king with the Anjou lily on Sundays and holidays on the flagpole in St. Mark's Square as a sign of its subordination. The most spectacular events of such royal meetings were the tournaments, which were organised in Diósgyőr beyond the palace walls on the riding tracks in the field. According to the legend, a long time ago, a dragon bringing good luck was hiding in the Matra Mountains from the people hunting for it. Only members of the Order of the Dragon founded by King Sigismund, the inhabitants of Kompolt in Kishnana nearby, knew about the dragon's hiding place, and they also loved and honoured the dragon. When the last man of Kompolt died without a successor, the dragon came down from the mountains to weep for its lost friend. As the knight was buried in the shrine of the castle church, the dragon descended into the castle well next to the church to be near him and fell into a deep sleep for 1,000 years. It is believed that when the 1,000 years expire, the dragon will wake up and come up from the well. The destroyed walls of the castle will stand erect again, and the knights will return to guard over justice, love and peace. János Kompolti I, builder of the castle of Kishnana from the late Middle Ages, was in fact guarding over peace in the 15th century. The construction of his castle is an excellent example of the process during which noblemen converted their simple mansion houses from the Anjou era into magnificent castles and then into strong fortresses. First, János Kompolti had a new residential building constructed in the 1430s. Behind the then 100-year-old wooden building of the family mansion and the parish church that his brother had had rebuilt in the Gothic style, he had the 2-storey mansion house with 2 rooms and a cellar built from stone, with a tower along the southern facade. However, soon afterwards, after the death of King Sigismund, the time of struggles for the throne had come, when instead of comfort, protection became the main function. János Kompolti had the new mansion house significantly extended and turned it into a castle surrounded with a board fence. But soon even this board fortification seemed insufficient. Bands of brigands formed from the remnants of the Czech Hussite armies, entrenched themselves in the territory of northern Hungary. So János Kompolti, who had been made leader of this mercenary army, started to build a fortress. Beyond the board fence parallel to it, he had a stone wall built around his castle. He had a new large stone gate tower erected, and finally, he had the board fence pulled down. It is believed that the dragon still brings good luck to those who draw in its breath when it yawns. To catch the right moment, all you have to do is throw a coin down the well. If it lands without making a noise, it has fallen into the dragon's open mouth. But if you hear the sound of the coin landing, then it has fallen on the dragon's scales and you have no luck. When Mátyás Corvinus succeeded to the throne, a relatively more peaceful period started in the life of castles. Due to the humanist ruler and his second wife, Beatrice of Aragon, the new style, the Renaissance, had also been introduced to the royal court. The 19-year-old Princess of Naples was taken to Mátyás in December 1476 by a delegation of Hungarian aristocrats of unparalleled pomposity. One of the attendants accompanying the bride was Mózes Gergelaki Buzlay Jr., who later became the king's widely travelled diplomat. And after the queen had arrived, she made the table and the way of life more highly cultured. She had magnificent dining rooms furnished, created splendid halls and gilded bedrooms. She ordered guards to stand at the door, stopped free entrance, and persuaded the Royal Highness to preserve his dignity more carefully, wrote Antonio Bonfini, chronicler of King Mátyás, when remembering the first measures taken by the young wife in her Hungarian home. The noblemen surrounding the king slowly adopted the new customs of the court. After King Mátyás died, from the 1490s they converted their sullen castles into comfortable Renaissance palaces. Moses Buzlay, who was well acquainted with the new style and had visited numerous royal courts in Europe, also did the same. He became Lord Steward of Vladislaus II and converted the castle to become his own residence, one of the most luxurious Renaissance castles of the era. While Kishnana was converted into a castle from a noble mansion house, Simontornya was originally built to be a castle on the plain along the river Sió. The fortification, that had been reconstructed and extended several times, was completely rebuilt by the new lord. On the southern side of the castle, surrounded with a moat, he had a Renaissance residential tower, a gate tower and a staircase tower built. The place of the old Gothic arcaded corridor of the neighbouring eastern wing was taken by a Renaissance loggia, which continued in the form of outside balconies resting on consoles on both sides. Being one of the high dignitaries of the royal court, Buzlay ordered the loggia, the Renaissance door and window frames and the fireplaces directly from Italian and Dalmatian stone carvers working in Buda. Similarly to his contemporaries, Moses Buzlay also thought that the Renaissance style imitating the ancient Rome did not suit a chapel, so he had the chapel and the new northern palace wing joining the chapel built in late Gothic style. The centre of the new building wing was occupied by a large, representative two-storey hall. The room on the ground floor was vaulted and a splendid bay window opened from the hall of the knights upstairs with a wooden ceiling. During this period, the castle of Tata was also a magnificent palace with a Renaissance loggia similar to the castle of Simontornya. After the constructions ordered by Sigismund, it was extended by King Mátyás and Vladislaus II. The Turkish threat resulted in a new turning point in Hungarian castle architecture. In the 15th century, cannons became widely used all over Europe, and against them the new forts with bastions constructed according to the Italian system provided efficient protection. First, the castle of Tata was fortified only by a new external protective wall and a round bastion. As this protection proved to be insufficient and the Turkish seized the castle in 1558, after it was recaptured between 1568 and 1577, it was reconstructed in accordance with the rules of the latest Italian castle architecture. Tata became an important link in the chain of Hungarian border fortresses, the outlying fort protecting Komorom. Due to the new art of war, the Gothic and Renaissance palaces of the Hungarian kingdom were converted into castles with Italian bastions. However, these border fortresses were forts serving military aims, and with their construction, the era of medieval castles ended.